Vienna, autumn 1814. The sky hung gray as ash. The wooden gates of the Hofburg stood shut. Inside a dim chamber, a queen's hand clutched the edge of her bed, trembling. A glass of red wine slipped from her fingers, shattered, and bled into the carpet like a slow-moving wound. She had once been the heart of two kingdoms. Now, Maria Carolina, sister to Marie Antoinette, was doubled over in agony, her lips pale, her breath ragged. The record would read, acute food poisoning. But was that the truth? Who wanted the queen dead? In this video, we open that silent door, tracing her path from the throne of Naples to the deck of an exile's ship to her final banquet, to ask whether it was an accident or a political execution. She was born into a dynasty where power was a birthright and duty began in the cradle. Maria Carolina, Louise Josepha Johanna, Antonietta, daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, entered the world on August 13, 1752, in Vienna. Hers was a life mapped out before her first breath. The halls she would walk, the languages she would speak, the alliances she would forge, none of it left to chance. She was the 13th child in a brood of 16, each sibling a pawn in the Habsburg chessboard of Europe. One sister would become the ill-fated Marie Antoinette of France, another the Duchess of Parma. Brothers Joseph II and Leopold II would wear the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. In this family, children weren't simply raised, they were deployed. From the moment she could stand in the shadow of Vienna's Hofburg Palace, Maria Carolina was groomed for rule. Tutors drilled her in diplomacy, history, and the art of calculated charm. She learned to dance with grace in the mirrored halls and to hold her own in the council chambers. Latin and French were not mere subjects. They were tools for statecraft. Even the way she handled a silk fan was measured, deliberate, meant to convey poise or displeasure without a single word. In the court of Maria Theresa, the girls were expected to be more than ornaments. They were emissaries in brocade, weapons sheathed in etiquette. Maria Carolina learned early that her smile could disarm a rival, her silence could unnerve an opponent, and her alliances, once made, were unshakable. Her marriage was not a matter of romance, it was a treaty. In 1768, at the age of 15, Maria Carolina was wed to Ferdinand IV of Naples and III of Sicily, a Bourbon prince and future king. The union was part of a calculated political strategy to strengthen ties between Austria and Spain's Bourbon dynasty. She was not the first Habsburg daughter considered for the match. Her elder sister, Maria Josepha, had been intended for Ferdinand, but died of smallpox before the wedding. Maria Carolina stepped into her place without hesitation, as duty demanded. The journey south was both literal and symbolic, a passage from the cold marble of Vienna to the sun-washed courts of Naples. She arrived in a land where the sea was a constant presence, where the air smelled of salt and citrus, and where politics were as volatile as the volcano that loomed over the bay. At first, her role was ceremonial. The young queen was expected to smile at processions, attend the theater, and bear heirs. But the marriage contract contained a clause that would shape her destiny. Once she gave birth to a male heir, she would be granted a seat on the kingdom's Council of State. In 1775, with the birth of her son Carlo Tito, that clause came into force. Maria Carolina stepped into the council chamber and never looked back. She was no longer just a queen consort. She was a ruler in her own right. Ferdinand, more interested in hunting and feasting than governance, left the machinery of state in her capable hands. She took control with the confidence of someone who had been preparing all her life. Ministers learned quickly that their reports would be scrutinized, their proposals dissected. She demanded clarity, precision, and results. Her style of rule was decisive, even relentless. She sought to modernize the kingdom's navy, reform trade policies, and expand education. She opened the court to British influence, forging alliances that would prove both valuable and dangerous. Her correspondence with European leaders was constant, her hand in affairs unmistakable. But power in Naples came with a cost. The Bourbon court was a nest of factions. Neapolitan nobles wary of Austrian interference, Spanish envoys guarding their influence, and church authorities watchful of any shift in the delicate balance between crown and altar. Maria Carolina's intelligence, combined with her assertiveness, made her admired by some and deeply resented by others. She could be warm, witty, and dazzling in conversation, but also blunt, even cutting when challenged. Her enemies called her arrogant. Her allies called her steadfast. Both were true. In public, she cultivated an image of regal authority, jeweled gowns, a posture as straight as the masts of the ships she commissioned, eyes that seemed to take in every corner of a room. In private, she was a strategist, moving pieces on the political board with a precision that echoed her mother's methods. By the late 1770s, she had become the de facto sovereign of Naples and Sicily. Foreign diplomats no longer sought audiences with Ferdinand. They sought her. Petitions, proposals, and even military plans crossed her desk. She was a queen who did not wait for history to shape her. She intended to shape it herself. But for all her strength, Maria Carolina was not blind to the dangers of her position. She had watched other royal women rise and fall, some by scandal, others by steel. Her own sister, Marie Antoinette, was still a beloved young queen in France. But the political winds in Europe were shifting. Ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity were beginning to spread beyond salons and pamphlets, into streets and armies. For now, in Naples, her power was secure. She had the trust of her husband, the loyalty of key ministers, and the respect, if grudging, of foreign courts. But beneath the glittering surface, enemies were counting the days, waiting for an opportunity. Maria Carolina had stepped into the light of power fully aware that it could burn. And yet, she did not flinch. Her reign had begun. By the late 1770s, the court of Naples no longer revolved around Ferdinand. It revolved around her. Maria Carolina had stepped into the role with a swiftness that startled her allies and unsettled her enemies. She was not content to be a ceremonial figure. She was determined to be the mind steering the ship of state. Naples, for all its beauty, was a kingdom at a crossroads. Positioned at the heart of the Mediterranean, it was a coveted prize for competing powers: Spain, Britain, France, and the rising naval forces that prowled the seas. Trade routes, ports, and political influence were currency here. And Maria Carolina meant to protect her share with calculated precision. Her vision was not merely to maintain the status quo. She wanted to modernize the realm. She advocated for naval expansion, commissioning new warships to guard against corsairs and to give Naples leverage in the shifting alliances of the era. She pushed for educational reforms, supporting schools that taught practical sciences alongside the classics. Preparing a new generation, not just for polite society, but for service to the kingdom. She encouraged trade, opening Naples to more British goods while carefully balancing relations with Spain. This move won her favor in London, but stirred resentment in Madrid, where Bourbon relatives feared she was tilting the kingdom away from traditional alliances. Her court became a place of both elegance and calculated politics. Ambassadors from Vienna, Paris, and London attended her salons, where music, art, and conversation mingled with the subtle exchange of intelligence. Beneath the candlelight and powdered wigs, deals were struck, promises made, and rivalries sharpened. Ferdinand, content to spend his days hunting, fishing, and indulging in the amusements of the countryside, offered little resistance. If anything, he seemed relieved to leave the burdens of governance to his capable wife. Ministers reported to her directly, and those who failed to meet her expectations were swiftly replaced. But power always comes at a price. Her decisiveness, her refusal to be merely ornamental, began to draw criticism. Some Neapolitan nobles saw her as an outsider meddling in their affairs. Spanish envoys whispered that she was too aligned with Austria and Britain. The clergy, while outwardly respectful, kept a watchful eye on her policies, especially her quiet efforts to limit certain privileges of the church in favor of strengthening the crown. Her personality, too, was a double-edged sword. She was sharp-tongued when she needed to be, unafraid to cut through flattery and false promises. In private letters, some foreign diplomats described her as a woman of great wit and formidable will, while others called her unyielding to the point of arrogance. Both descriptions were true, and Maria Carolina was fully aware of it. She could be charming, laughing easily, engaging guests with stories of Vienna and tales from her travels. But she was also capable of a cold, regal silence that could freeze a room. Those who sought to undermine her quickly learned that she was not a queen to be trifled with. And yet, beneath the layers of statecraft and ceremony, she still held on to certain ideals. Influenced by the Enlightenment current sweeping Europe, she initially supported moderate reforms, improved legal codes, better treatment for the poor, efforts to curb corruption in the bureaucracy. She believed a strong kingdom required not only power at the top, but stability among the people. Still, every reform was weighed against the reality of preserving the monarchy. She was not a revolutionary. She was a monarchist to the core. Her loyalty to the crown and to the Habsburg-Bourbon alliance was unshakable. By the mid-1780s, her influence extended beyond Naples and Sicily. Through letters and envoys, she maintained close ties with her family in Austria and with key figures in Britain. She corresponded with her sister Marie Antoinette, offering both advice and warnings about the increasingly hostile mood in France. At the time, she could not have imagined just how prophetic those warnings would become. Within Naples, she tightened her network of loyalists. Key naval officers, influential merchants, and members of the nobility owed their positions and their fortunes to her patronage. This network gave her considerable leverage, but it also made her a target. The more power she gathered, the more determined her enemies became to see her brought down. Court gossip became a weapon. Whispers that she was too close to British interests, too controlling of her husband, too willing to bypass traditional channels of authority. In the salons of her rivals, she was painted as a foreign interloper ruling by proxy, a dangerous narrative in a kingdom that valued its independence. Maria Carolina, however, thrived under pressure. She seemed to draw energy from the challenges, responding to slights with decisive action rather than retreat. When a faction of nobles attempted to block one of her naval initiatives, she quietly rallied support from merchants who stood to gain from the increased protection of shipping lanes. The plan passed, and her opponents were left to seethe in private. She was aware of the thin line she walked, how quickly admiration could turn to resentment, and how loyalty could be bought but not guaranteed. But she believed that strength, not compromise, was the key to survival. Still, the storm clouds were gathering, even if the skies over Naples seemed clear. Across Europe, the political map was shifting. Revolution was brewing in France. Ideals of liberty and equality were no longer confined to pamphlets. They were being shouted in the streets. Maria Carolina could not yet see the tidal wave that would change everything. The wave that would carry away not just her sister's throne in Paris, but the delicate balance of power she had worked so hard to preserve in Naples. For now she held her place, commanding the council, steering the ship of state, and enjoying the full authority her position allowed. But even as she stood at the height of her power, the seeds of future conflict were already sown. And when those seeds began to sprout, they would turn her from a reformer into something else entirely. The letter arrived in the autumn of 1793, carried on a cold wind from Paris. It was sealed with black wax, the color of mourning, and the messenger who brought it would not meet her eyes. Maria Carolina knew before she broke the seal that the news inside would wound her in a way no battle, no court intrigue ever could. Marie Antoinette was dead, not dead in exile, not quietly poisoned in a guarded palace room, but executed in the open air before a roaring crowd. Guillotined in the Place de la Révolution, her head held aloft for the mob to see. Maria Carolina sat in silence, the letter trembling in her hands. The words blurred. Her sister's final days, imprisonment, humiliation, the show trial, spooled through her mind in flashes of horror. She thought of Versailles, of laughter in candlelit halls, of the way Marie Antoinette had signed her letters simply Ton Antoinette. Those memories now felt like relics of a vanished world. She dropped the letter. It slid to the marble floor. The candles on her desk flickered as though the air itself had recoiled. Somewhere in the palace, a clock struck the hour. The news struck her like a physical blow, but it also lit a fire. Any illusions she had about the spread of revolutionary ideas evaporated in that moment. The French Revolution was not simply a political shift. It was a guillotine hanging over every crown in Europe. If it could devour her sister, a queen by birth and by marriage, it could devour anyone. From that day forward, Maria Carolina's politics hardened. She had once entertained certain Enlightenment reforms, seeing them as tools to strengthen the monarchy. But the revolution in France, its slogans of liberty, equality, fraternity, had revealed itself to her as a contagion. And she would meet contagion with quarantine. She ordered the tightening of censorship in Naples. Newspapers and pamphlets were monitored. Intellectuals with a whiff of republicanism about them were watched, questioned, sometimes banished. The salons that had once hosted open debates on philosophy now echoed with whispers, the air thick with suspicion. British diplomats noted the shift. Her Majesty's temper has sharpened, one wrote. Where she once sought compromise, she now seeks control. Her allies in the conservative courts of Europe applauded the change, seeing in Maria Carolina a fellow soldier in the fight against revolution. But in Naples, the crackdown bred resentment. Scholars and merchants who had benefited from her earlier reforms now found themselves under scrutiny. Even some nobles, wary of the growing reach of her intelligence network, began to chafe under her rule. Maria Carolina didn't care. The stakes, in her mind, were survival itself, of the crown, of the order it represented, and of her own family. The French had killed her sister. She would not give them, or their imitators, the satisfaction of doing the same to her. Her grief became policy. Her sorrow became law. She increased Naples's cooperation with Britain, aligning the kingdom more closely with the anti-revolutionary coalition. British ships were welcomed in Neapolitan ports, their captains treated with honors that sometimes exceeded those given to her own allies. This earned her the admiration of London, but it also drew the attention and the ire of France. In the council chambers, her tone was colder now, her patience shorter. Ministers who hesitated in carrying out her directives were dismissed without ceremony. Those who served loyally found themselves rewarded handsomely, cementing a court culture in which obedience was survival. Yet in her private hours, the loss still bled through. On certain nights, attendants would find her alone in her study, staring at a small portrait of Marie Antoinette. Sometimes she would speak softly, as though her sister might somehow hear her across the gulf of death. Her daughters, too young to understand the politics of it all, would sometimes find their mother in these moods. "Why are you sad, Mama?" one of them once asked. Maria Carolina answered without looking away from the portrait. "Because they killed my sister, and they would kill me too, if they could." In that single sentence was all the clarity she needed to justify her course. She tightened the bonds between Naples and Austria, ensuring that her Habsburg family would be ready to support her if unrest reached her own shores. She worked to root out any trace of Republican sentiment, whether in the universities, the army, or the ports. The sea might bring trade and prosperity, but it could also bring pamphlets, ideas, and agitators from France. She meant to keep those waters guarded. Her transformation from reformist queen to staunch reactionary did not happen overnight, but the death of Marie Antoinette was the hinge upon which her political life turned. Before, she had been willing to bend. After, she would only stand firm. The effect on her enemies was mixed. Some feared her more than ever, unwilling to cross a queen so visibly resolute. Others saw in her inflexibility an opportunity to paint her as oppressive, to turn public sentiment against her, to wait for the moment when her severity would alienate more subjects than it protected. Maria Carolina, however, believed that in times of crisis, mercy could look like weakness, and weakness could be fatal. Better to be feared than to fall to the same blade that had claimed her sister. Still, the walls around her life were closing in. Every act of suppression gained her new adversaries. Every move on the diplomatic chessboard brought counter-moves from France and its allies. And every letter from her surviving siblings in Vienna carried another reminder that the storm sweeping Europe was far from over. For now, Naples was safe. But revolutions have a way of crossing borders, and grief has a way of hardening into something far less forgiving. And Maria Carolina was no longer just a queen. She was a fortress. For Maria Carolina, the revolution in France had been a thunderclap. But the years that followed brought a slower, more personal storm. One that eroded her strength not in a single blow, but in steady, merciless waves. She had always known that royal motherhood was less about sentiment and more about succession. Still, she had entered it with hope. Over the course of her marriage, she bore 18 children. Each birth was celebrated with ceremony. Each christening was a carefully choreographed declaration of dynastic stability. But behind the grand public displays was a private battlefield. More than half of those children would not live to see adulthood. Disease, infancy's fragile defenses, and the medical ignorance of the era claimed them one by one. The losses began early. Some infants slipped away after only weeks, others after a few short years. Enough time for her to memorize their faces, their laughter, their cries. The court would don mourning black, the bells would toll, and then life in the palace where humanity would resume as though nothing had happened. But for Maria Carolina, each loss was a fresh wound. The deepest cut came with the death of Carlo Tito, her first surviving son and heir. He had been the embodiment of her political security. the child whose birth had opened the doors to the Council of State, whose very existence cemented her authority. She had watched him grow into a bright, inquisitive boy, trained in the arts of leadership, groomed to take the throne one day. When illness claimed him, it was not swift. Fever gripped him in the night, and for days she sat at his bedside, refusing to leave, speaking to him in the same calm tone she had used when he was a child learning to read. Ministers waited outside her door, their political petitions forgotten in the face of the Queen's vigil. But prayers and power could not hold back the tide. When Carlo Tito breathed his last, something in her changed. It was not a collapse. It was a hardening, a closing off. If the world could take her son, it could take anything. She would meet it with a wall of ice. The portraits of her lost children multiplied. She had them hung in her private apartments, rows of painted faces that never aged, their eyes fixed forever in the moment before illness struck. Visitors to her chambers noticed the stillness there, the heavy air. One foreign ambassador wrote, "Her Majesty's rooms are like a chapel for the dead." In public, she remained the image of control. She attended council meetings, received diplomats, and continued to direct the affairs of Naples and Sicily with her usual precision. But those who knew her well saw the shift. Her laughter came less easily. Her trust was harder to earn. The warmth she had once shown to her closest advisors was replaced by a guarded politeness. Loss had taught her two things: that the world would not spare her simply because she was a queen, and that survival required a certain cruelty, not necessarily toward others, but toward her own vulnerability. The palace itself began to mirror her mood. The salons were quieter, the entertainments less frequent. When musicians played in the great hall, the melodies seemed slower, more somber. Even the way she dressed began to change. Still regal, but with darker fabrics, deeper hues, as though to remind the world that she had earned the right to her sorrow. Grief, however, did not soften her politically. If anything, it sharpened her resolve. She doubled down on the measures she believed would protect the monarchy from the chaos spreading across Europe. To those who accused her of being unyielding, she would point to her own life. "I have bent, and the wind has snapped what I love. I will not bend again." But grief is not static. It shifts, changes shape, creeps into unexpected corners. Sometimes it came to her in the middle of a council session. A sudden memory, the echo of a child's voice in her mind. And she would have to pause, her hand tightening around the edge of her chair. Other times it visited her at night, in dreams where her lost children were still alive, calling to her from a sunlit garden she could never reach. Her surviving children became her focus, and yet her protection of them often bordered on suffocating. She monitored their tutors, scrutinized their friends, and intervened in their choices. She believed she was shielding them from danger, but it also drove wedges between them. Even Ferdinand, her husband, noticed the change. He was never a deeply introspective man, but he understood enough to see that the wife who had once met him in the garden to talk politics now spent more hours alone, her letters unanswered, her tea cooling beside untouched papers. In those years, the palace felt like a fortress under siege, not from armies or revolutionaries, but from absence. The empty rooms of children who would never return seemed to echo more loudly than the footsteps of the living. And in that echo, Maria Carolina's heart turned ever colder toward the outside world. The tragedies of her private life became armor for her public one. She would face ministers, nobles, and foreign envoys with unflinching resolve, but she carried her grief like a hidden blade, sharp, silent, and always at the ready. The enemies she had gathered over the years saw only the steel. They did not see the portraits on her wall, the long nights awake, the quiet prayers whispered to no one in particular. But the truth was that every loss had left a mark, and those marks were beginning to form cracks. Cracks that would widen when fate struck again, not with disease or revolution, but with the kind of political exile that strips away the last illusions of safety. And when that day came, Maria Carolina would be forced to watch her world recede from the deck of a ship, the coastline of Naples fading into the same distance where so many of her children had already gone. The winter of 1798 came with an invasion. French troops, hardened by years of Revolutionary War, marched south under the tricolor. For weeks, rumors had reached the court of Naples. Victories in the north, cities falling, old alliances crumbling. But Maria Carolina had believed, perhaps willed herself to believe, that Naples could hold. It could not. The speed of the collapse was staggering. Republican sympathizers within Naples, long kept in check by her surveillance, now saw the French army as deliverance. Neapolitan troops, poorly trained and poorly led, melted away before the enemy. Panic gripped the capital. Markets emptied. Nobles fled in disguise. In the council chamber, the queen's face was a mask. She listened to frantic reports, issued orders to secure the palace, and summoned her British allies. But the truth was unavoidable. The Bourbon crown in Naples could not be defended. The plan was swift and brutal in its simplicity. Evacuate the royal family to Sicily. The British fleet, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, would carry them across the water before the French entered the city. On the night of departure, the palace was a shadow of itself. Tapestries had been pulled from the walls, treasures packed in haste. Servants whispered in corners, uncertain if they would be left behind. Maria Carolina moved through the halls with deliberate steps, pausing only once, at a window overlooking the city. The streets she had ruled for decades were dark, the lamps extinguished to save oil. The silence broken only by the distant sound of boots on cobblestones. She boarded the ship with her children, her husband Ferdinand trailing behind. The air was sharp with salt and smoke. From the deck she could see Naples fading into the darkness, the faint outline of Vesuvius looming over a city now under another's banner. She did not look away. The voyage to Sicily was no ceremonial procession. The sea was rough, the cabins cramped. For a queen accustomed to the gilt and marble of Naples, the conditions were a humiliation. But Maria Carolina's pride would not allow her to show discomfort. She stood on deck in the freezing wind, her hair unbound, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if daring the French to follow. Behind her, the political humiliation was complete. In Naples, the French declared the creation of the Parthenopean Republic, a state that owed its existence to the revolution she had fought so fiercely to contain. They called her a tyrant, a despot, the enemy of liberty. Her name was spat in the streets she had once paraded through in triumph. In Sicily, she was still queen, but stripped of the machinery of power. The island was poor, its resources limited, and its people suspicious of outsiders, even ones wearing a crown. Ferdinand retreated further into his diversions, leaving Maria Carolina to navigate the fragile politics of exile. She negotiated with the British, pressed for a counteroffensive, and tried to hold together the court in exile with what remained of her authority. But exile is a slow poison. It eats away at certainty, at the sense of inevitability that monarchs carry like a second skin. Each day away from Naples chipped at the grandeur of her rule. The court, cramped into hastily adapted villas, became a place of murmurs about when or if they would return and whether the queen's stubbornness had brought them here. Maria Carolina did not shrink from these whispers. She met them head-on, often in cutting tones. "Would you prefer the guillotine?" she once asked a complaining noble. "Because I have seen what awaits those who wait too long to flee." The British, pragmatic as ever, valued her as an ally against France, but were wary of her absolutist instincts. Nelson himself admired her courage but saw the danger in her unwillingness to bend. To London, she was both an asset and a liability, a monarch who could inspire resistance, but also one whose rigid control might alienate potential supporters. Her enemies, meanwhile, multiplied. In Naples, Republicans celebrated her absence. In Vienna, certain members of her own family questioned her judgment. Even in Sicily, rival factions at court jockeyed for influence, sensing an opportunity to rise while the Queen's footing was uncertain. Still, she refused to surrender her vision. She pressed for the formation of militias, for diplomatic pressure on France, for any means of reclaiming Naples. When, in 1799, Bourbon forces, with British help, finally retook the city, she did not return in triumphal procession. She arrived quietly, and with her came the reckoning. The restoration of Bourbon rule was swift and merciless. Maria Carolina's enemies were hunted, tried, and executed. Some were hanged in the public squares, others were beheaded. The Queen was accused of orchestrating these reprisals personally, of turning the restored monarchy into a theater of vengeance. Whether she ordered each death or not, her name was linked to them all. It was a return, but not a victory. Naples was changed. The French had left their mark, new ideas, new loyalties, a lingering taste for rebellion. The Queen's power, though restored, was brittle. She knew the city could turn again. And so, when the political tides shifted once more, and the alliances she relied on began to fray, Maria Carolina found herself facing an even colder betrayal. Not from a foreign invader, but from within her own family. The next exile would not come by sea under the shadow of an invading army. It would come quietly, carried out by those closest to her, with no enemy's flag in sight. The Bourbon flag flew once more over Naples, but it was not the same Naples Maria Carolina had left. The streets still bore the scars of rebellion, walls pocked with musket fire, plazas where gallows had stood now eerily empty. The air carried a faint tang of smoke, as if the city had not fully exhaled from its fever. Her return in 1799 was stripped of ceremony. No golden carriages, no triumphal arches, no ringing bells. She came ashore in the early morning, cloaked in heavy wool against the sea wind, her face partially veiled. The official story was that she wished to avoid unrest. The truth was more bitter. Her presence no longer inspired the kind of adulation that could fill streets. Inside the palace, things were familiar but altered. The marble floors still gleamed, but the courtiers' bows were shorter, their smiles thinner. Ministers she had once commanded now measured their words with careful neutrality, as though gauging how long her restored authority would last. Ferdinand, ever the reluctant king, avoided the heavy work of governance and withdrew into his preferred diversions, hunting, fishing, and elaborate meals. It left Maria Carolina once again to shoulder the burden of state. She did so with her usual rigor, summoning councils, drafting orders, and negotiating with foreign envoys. But the undertow of distrust was constant. The British, whose ships had been her salvation during exile, were now cautious partners. Their support for the Bourbon throne was rooted in strategic interests, not in personal loyalty to her. They admired her resolve, but feared her absolutism, wary that her iron grip might push Naples into yet another revolt. Even her own court had shifted. Some nobles, emboldened by her absence, had carved out spheres of influence they were reluctant to relinquish. Others resented the executions that had followed the Restoration, whispering that the Queen's thirst for retribution had gone too far. Maria Carolina heard these whispers, sometimes through servants, sometimes in the hesitant phrasing of ministers, and she met them with the same steel she had carried since Vienna. But the whispers multiplied all the same. The most dangerous change, however, was not in her enemies. It was in her heir. Crown Prince Francis, her son and the future Ferdinand I of the two Sicilies, had grown into a cautious, calculating man. Raised in the shadow of his mother's formidable will, Francis had learned both to obey and to quietly resent. Now, with Naples once more under Bourbon rule, he saw an opportunity to assert himself. Not in open defiance, but in subtle steps to limit her reach. Where once ministers deferred to the Queen, they now sought the prince's approval before implementing her directives. Where once military officers answered her summons, they now claimed conflicting orders from Francis. It was not rebellion. It was erosion, a slow siphoning of her power from within the walls of her own palace. Maria Carolina recognized the signs. She had seen them in other courts. How the son of a reigning monarch could become the fulcrum for change, not by confrontation, but by quiet accumulation of authority. She had once been the young force at a complacent king's side. Now she was the ruler being edged toward the margins. In public, she masked the strain. At audiences, she spoke with her customary precision, her gaze level and unwavering. At state dinners, she wore her jewels and smiled in that deliberate way that suggested command, not warmth. But in private, her letters to her allies in Vienna and London grew sharper, tinged with frustration. It was in one of these letters, intercepted and shown to the prince, that she referred to her opponents in court as traitors in silk. The phrase spread quickly, mutating into a rallying point for those who believed her reign had outlasted its welcome. The final blow came not with a coup, but with a suggestion, couched as concern for her health. Francis and his advisors proposed that she rest from state affairs, allowing others to manage the daily burdens. Officially, it was temporary. In practice, it was the beginning of her removal. Her seat in the Council of State, once guaranteed by her marriage contract, was quietly reassigned. Letters that had once crossed her desk now bypassed her entirely. Guards at certain doors of the palace were instructed to turn her away under the guise of protocol. She was still the queen, but now in name more than in fact. It was exile without the sea voyage, banishment in her own palace. At night, she walked the long corridors of the royal apartments, past portraits of herself painted in her years of authority. The gilded frames seemed to mock her, each brushstroke a reminder of the woman who had once commanded ministers and armies, now reduced to moving silently through candlelit halls. Her health, already worn thin by decades of strain, began to falter. She suffered bouts of fever, crushing headaches, and an increasing difficulty in breathing. Some attributed it to age. Others whispered about poison in her food or drink. Maria Carolina, for her part, dismissed the idea publicly, but grew increasingly careful about what she consumed. The irony was not lost on her. She had survived revolutions, wars, and exile across seas, only to be undone by the invisible currents of palace politics. The hands that were pushing her aside were not those of foreign enemies. They were her own blood. Still, she held to her pride. To visitors, she would say, "I remain Maria Carolina, and that is enough." But in the quiet of her chambers, she began to consider the possibility that the throne she had fought to protect might become her final prison. What she did not yet know was that the prison walls would soon extend far beyond Naples, that the next and final exile would strip her not only of power, but of her kingdom, her court, and her home. And it would begin with a ship, once again waiting in the harbor. The morning was cloudless, the sea deceptively calm. From the windows of her chambers, Maria Carolina could see the masts of ships swaying in the harbor, their rigging glinting in the pale sun. One of them, she already knew, was meant for her. It had been weeks since she had last presided over any council, weeks since ministers had even bothered to send her reports. The palace had grown unnervingly quiet around her. Doors that once opened at her approach now stayed closed until someone else gave permission. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. The air felt staged, as if the very walls had been instructed to pretend she wasn't there. The official order came not from her son's mouth, but in the form of a sealed document placed on her writing desk by a servant who wouldn't meet her eyes. It was written with all the courtesies of royal correspondence. Phrases about her beloved health, her honored dignity, and temporary relocation for her comfort. But the meaning beneath the florid ink was plain. She was to leave Naples at once. The destination was Vienna, under the pretense of reuniting with her family. In truth, it was a strategic removal. Her son and his advisors no longer wanted the shadow of her influence looming over the court. The ship waiting in the harbor was not a carriage of honor. It was an exile in plain daylight. Maria Carolina did not rage. She had learned long ago that fury wasted in the open only served your enemies. Instead, she summoned her ladies-in-waiting and began to pack. The act was deliberate, ceremonial. Each jewel, each folded gown, each sealed letter placed into her trunks was a statement that she left as a queen, not as a defeated supplicant. But inside, she felt the sting of betrayal burn hotter than any political defeat she had suffered before. She had rebuilt this throne after revolution. She had faced down French armies, foreign spies, and the fury of the mob. And yet the blow that struck her now had been delivered by her own blood, by the child she had once cradled, whose crown she had protected at the cost of her own safety. The day of departure was eerily still. The streets between the palace and the harbor were cleared, ostensibly to ensure her safe passage, but in reality to avoid any public display of loyalty that might embarrass the new regime. There were no cheering crowds, no handkerchiefs waved from windows. Only the sound of hooves on cobblestones and the creak of the carriage as it descended toward the water. At the docks, the ship stood ready, its sails furled, its crew silent. The gangplank stretched like a narrow bridge between the world she had ruled and the uncertain future that waited. A few courtiers attended, their faces blank with the kind of polite detachment that masked both discomfort and relief. Maria Carolina paused before boarding, turning one last time toward the skyline of Naples. The sun caught the domes and spires, the pale facades of palaces and churches, the glitter of the bay. She had ruled here for decades, shaping its politics, its alliances, its very identity. Now, it seemed to retreat from her gaze, as if erasing her, even as she looked. The captain bowed as she stepped aboard, but she noticed his orders came not from her, but from a sealed packet delivered earlier that morning. Likely instructions to deliver her directly into the hands of Austrian custody. Once the gangplank was drawn, the sound of the harbor fell away, replaced by the steady rhythm of water against the hull. She stood at the stern as Naples receded into a haze, her gloved hands gripping the rail. The wind tugged at her veil, and for a moment, she let it lift. Her profile sharp against the light, her eyes unblinking. The voyage was long, and the accommodations were carefully dignified, but far from luxurious. Meals were plain, the crew distant. She spent much of her time in her cabin, writing letters she suspected would never be delivered. Some were to her daughters, others to old allies, and a few to monarchs who might still remember the woman she had been. But the tone was different now, less commanding, more reflective, as though she sensed that her role in the great game of Europe was ending. When storms struck, the ship pitched violently, and she clung to the brass rail of her bed, refusing assistance from her attendants. She had survived worse seas before, but this voyage felt heavier, not from the waves, but from the knowledge that she was being carried not toward opportunity, but toward irrelevance. Weeks later, Vienna appeared on the horizon, not as a homecoming, but as the stage for her final chapter. Her return to the Austrian court was polite, even warm in the formal sense. But she was no longer a player. She was an aging widow of politics, tucked into guest apartments, offered ceremonial honors that meant nothing in the decisions of the empire. From those windows, she watched the seasons turn. Snow fell in silence over the city, melting into spring rain. She heard news of Naples only in fragments, reforms passed without her, alliances forged without her signature, her name increasingly absent from diplomatic dispatches. The exile was complete. She was no longer Maria Carolina, the Queen of Naples and Sicily. She was Maria Carolina, a royal guest whose power existed only in memory. But in her heart, she clung to one truth. The story was not yet over. There would be one more journey, one more gathering of enemies and allies, one more table where food and wine would be served. And it would be at that table where her life would finally, and perhaps deliberately, end. It was early September, and Vienna was heavy with the scent of autumn. Dry leaves crushed under carriage wheels, smoke from hearths curling into the morning air. The city was preparing for the Congress of Vienna, a gathering meant to redraw the map of Europe after Napoleon's fall. It was a time of champagne toasts and diplomatic whispers, of glittering salons where alliances were sealed not in ink, but in the clink of glasses. Maria Carolina was not part of those negotiations. She had not been invited to the great tables where kings and ministers carved up empires, but she was still a queen in title, and sometimes the Austrian court remembered that titles demanded appearances. One such appearance came in the form of an invitation, embossed, courteous, impossible to refuse. A private dinner in her honor at a noble residence just beyond the old city walls. She was told it was to celebrate her return to Vienna, though she had been in the city for months. The pretext was thin, but the formality of it was unassailable. The carriage ride was quiet, the wheels murmuring over cobblestones slick with evening rain. She sat upright, her gown a deep violet trimmed with black lace, her hair drawn back in a style that emphasized the sharpness of her profile. She had dressed not for the flattery of the hosts, but as armor. Queens, she had learned, must wear dignity like a shield, even when the battle is already lost. The house was grand but not ostentatious, lit by 100 candles that painted the marble floors in molten gold. Servants bowed as she entered the dining hall, where a long table stretched beneath a chandelier that glittered like a cage of ice. The other guests were an assortment of minor nobles, a few foreign envoys, and, conspicuously, no one from Naples. Her host greeted her warmly, though she noticed the tightness around his smile, the quick flicker of his eyes toward a man in the corner who did not approach. She had learned to notice such things, the undercurrents that ran below the polite surface. The meal began with toasts. Crystal glasses caught the light as wine was poured, rich and red. Conversation drifted around her in pleasant, meaningless currents. Weather, music, the latest gossip from Paris. If there were politics here, they were buried deep beneath the civility. But there was something else, too. A certain attentiveness to her plate, her glass. Whenever she sipped, someone seemed to watch. Whenever she laid down her fork, a servant stepped forward, almost too quickly to refill or replace. The first course was delicate. Thin slices of smoked fish, garnished with lemon. She tasted little, her appetite dulled by habit and suspicion. The second was a roasted game bird, its skin lacquered to a golden sheen. She ate more of that, finding it rich but oddly bitter beneath the seasoning. By the third course, an elaborate confection of sweetened chestnuts, her stomach had begun to twist. At first, she thought it was simply the heaviness of the food. But as the minutes passed, the discomfort sharpened into pain, curling deep in her abdomen. She kept her face composed. To show weakness at a table, even among supposed friends, was to invite a kind of pity she refused to accept. She sipped water, listening as the conversation swelled and ebbed around her. When the final toast was made, she rose slowly, her chair scraping the marble. The guests applauded, the host beamed, and Maria Carolina inclined her head in a gesture of regal gratitude. Only when she turned away from the table did she allow her fingers to tighten on the back of a chair for support. The carriage ride back to her residence was a blur. The gas lamps along the streets swam in her vision, their halos merging and breaking apart. The pain in her stomach was now joined by waves of nausea, a burning in her throat. Her attendant asked if she wished to stop, but she shook her head. She wanted no scene in the streets of Vienna. By the time they reached her apartments, the pain was constant, pulsing. She dismissed her servants with a faint smile, claiming she was only tired. Alone, she gripped the edge of her writing desk, her breath shallow, sweat gathering along her hairline. She thought of her sister Marie Antoinette, who had faced her own death in the open, before a crowd. This, whatever it was different. It was a death, if death it was meant to be, carried out in shadows, without trial, without verdict. The clock in her chamber struck midnight. She lay on her bed, fully dressed, her gloved hands resting on her stomach as if to hold herself together. Outside, the Congress of Vienna celebrated another night of diplomacy. Inside, a queen began her final vigil. By dawn, the sky over Vienna was a dull sheet of gray, the kind that made the city seem carved from stone. Inside her apartments, Maria Carolina lay curled on her bed, her breath uneven. The night had been a blur of pain and sickness. Sharp cramps twisting through her abdomen, waves of nausea that left her weak and trembling. Her ladies-in-waiting, summoned in haste, exchanged glances over her prone form. The queen's skin was cold and clammy, her lips pale, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. When they suggested calling a physician, she nodded once, too drained to speak. The first doctor arrived within the hour, his coat still damp from the morning mist. He examined her with the brisk detachment of a man who had seen illness often. But as his hands moved over her abdomen, his expression shifted. Something between concern and calculation. He asked what she had eaten. Her ladies listed the courses from the night before, their voices faltering. The doctor prescribed a bitter tonic, insisting it would settle the humors. But it offered no relief. By midday, a second physician was called. He spoke in low tones with the first, their conversation filled with phrases like acute inflammation and possible contamination. They agreed she should be kept warm and hydrated, but neither offered a clear diagnosis. The palace corridors began to hum with whispers. Some said it was simply food poisoning, a tragic misfortune, nothing more. Others murmured darker possibilities, that the banquet had been a pretext, that something in the wine or the sauce had been meant for her alone. Maria Carolina herself did not voice suspicion, but her mind wandered back over the past months. She remembered the quick, watchful glances at the dinner table, the speed with which her plate had been replaced, the faint bitterness under the roasted meat. If this was the work of an enemy, she thought, they had chosen a method designed not to shock, but to erase. As the day wore on, her condition worsened. The pain grew sharper, radiating through her body. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air in the room. Her attendants sponged her face and hands, murmuring encouragement. But the queen's eyes were far away, fixed on a point beyond the ceiling, beyond the room. By evening, word of her illness had reached the Austrian court. A few dignitaries arrived to inquire after her health, their condolences wrapped in courtly language. They did not linger. Illness in royalty was not merely a matter of sympathy. It was a matter of politics. And politics had no patience for lingering too close to the sickbed of a potentially dying queen. In the quiet between visits, Maria Carolina asked for paper and ink. With trembling fingers, she began to write, not official decrees, but personal letters. One to her daughter, Maria Amalia, in Saxony. One to her son Francis in Naples. One, perhaps the most painful, to her grandson, the future Ferdinand II. The words came slowly, her handwriting uneven, but she pressed on, as if each sentence was an anchor against the tide pulling her away. Her ladies tried to dissuade her from writing, urging her to rest, but she refused. "If I sleep," she whispered, "I may not wake, and then what I need to say will be lost." That night, her fever rose. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the boundaries between dream and waking blurring. In her dreams, she was back in Naples, the bay stretching blue and bright before her, the city alive with the clamor of markets and the tolling of church bells. But the sound warped, turning into the clang of ship bells, the cold echo of exile. She saw faces, friends and enemies alike, fading into the shadows. When she woke, the room was dim, lit only by the glow of a single candle. One of her ladies sat beside the bed, holding her hand. Maria Carolina's voice was barely audible. "Tell them," she began, then trailed off, the words swallowed by a wave of pain. The next morning, the doctors returned, their faces grave. The official diagnosis was acute gastric inflammation. It was the kind of term that explained nothing, the kind that closed rather than opened questions. The court accepted it without challenge, at least publicly. But in the salons and antechambers of Vienna, the whispers continued. Some pointed to the Congress, to the shifting alliances that might have made her inconvenient. Others noted her long history of political maneuvering, the enemies she had accumulated over decades. A queen without a throne was still a figure who could influence, even unsettle, the fragile balance of power. By the third day, her strength was nearly gone. She could no longer sit upright without assistance. Her voice had thinned to a whisper, her once commanding gaze dulled by exhaustion. Yet there was still something in her eyes, an ember of defiance that refused to be fully extinguished. She asked for her rosary and held it tightly, the beads clicking softly under her fingers. Outside, the city moved on, carriages rattling over cobblestones, merchants shouting in the markets, diplomats toasting in candlelit halls. Inside, the world of Maria Carolina was collapsing into the narrow space between her bed and the flickering candlelight. The poison, if poison it was, had done its work. It had stripped her not only of strength, but of the dignity of choosing her own final moment. And yet, even as the fever climbed, she remained, in her own mind, a queen. What happened next would pass quickly into history. The final night, the stillness of her last breath, and the official record that would close the matter forever. But history would not remember the sound of that stillness, or the question that hovered unanswered above her deathbed. Was it chance? Or was it a sentence? Maria Carolina of Austria died on September 8, 1814. The official statement was brief, stripped of detail. Her Majesty passed peacefully, attended by her household and physicians. There was no mention of the banquet, no mention of the pain, and certainly no mention of suspicion. The court moved quickly, as courts always do, to fold the event into ceremony. Her body was prepared, dressed in black silk, her hands arranged over a crucifix. She was buried in the imperial crypt of the Capuchin Church, among emperors, empresses, and their forgotten children. The service was dignified, restrained, and remarkably short. By the next morning, the Congress of Vienna resumed without pause. The business of carving Europe proceeding as if a queen had not died within its walls. In the days that followed, her name vanished from the public conversation. Newspapers gave her a paragraph. Political memoirs, written years later, mentioned her as a footnote. Even in Naples, where she had once ruled with force and cunning, her death passed without mourning from the halls of power. And perhaps that was the point. If her death was deliberate, it was not meant to shock. It was meant to erase. The kind of ending where no one demands an investigation, because the silence suits too many. As I tell you this, I find myself thinking about the difference between dying and being erased. Death is inevitable. Erasure is a choice, made by the living, enforced by those who hold the pen of history. Maria Carolina may have been poisoned, or she may have been undone by chance. But either way, what followed was the same. A swift burial, a sealed record, and a world that turned the page before the ink was dry. And that is why stories like hers matter. Because history is not just the record of what happened. It is the memory of who mattered. And in the official memory of 1814, she was written out. In telling it now, we put her back in. In this channel, we open those sealed doors, brush away the dust, and speak the names that power wanted to forget. If you want to hear more stories like this, about the rulers, rebels, and ordinary souls whose lives ended in silence, then join us. Subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled and help keep these voices alive. Because the moment we stop telling their stories, that's when they truly disappear.